the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respect to elders past and present, as well as to emerging leaders. And I extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. So let's do some housekeeping. Just so everyone is aware, we will be recording today. Someone will also be monitoring the chat. So if you've got any questions, just reach out there and someone will get back to you. And we also have captioned enabled. So welcome to AYAC's National Youth Practitioner Network, or NYPN, discussion on youth civic and political engagement. For those that don't know, my name's Dean. I am AYAC's National Youth Engagement Lead. And as you can probably tell, I'm not from Australia. I'm actually from Northern Ireland, which unfortunately isn't the easiest accents to follow. So I will be enunciating normal words and making sure that everybody can follow along as easily as possible. So just to give you some background on the NYPN, we launched it last year to provide an additional space to bring the sector together at that national level so that we can talk about the issues that are really important to us. You can also find a little summary document of our roundtable last year on social cohesion on our blog NYPN Briefing. But we decided today to start this session with a discussion on youth civic and political engagement, as some of the coverage of the recent round of civics tests really prompted us to think about how we contribute to really building those strengths-based approaches to youth civic and political engagement, how we help foster that within young people, provide them with the confidence and spaces so that they can shape those debates. So what we're going to be looking at today is what is our role as a sector within youth civic and political engagement. And to help us on our way, we will be hearing some evidence around youth civic and political engagement from Professor Philippa Collin. We'll then be having two thematic discussions in breakout rooms. And to make sure that you all get the opportunity to speak to as many different people as possible within the sector, we'll also mix them up a bit so you can get to speak to different people in each breakout room. So hopefully we'll be in for a really fun afternoon where we'll hear a little bit about the academic literature on the topic, but also really get to hear those perspectives from practitioners and learn from each other about what we are experiencing in our practice. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Professor Philippa Collin. Pip is a professorial research fellow at Western Sydney University and co-director of the Young and Resilience Centre. She mainly investigates young people's relationships to democracy, the role of digital in youth citizenship, health and well-being, and methodological innovations and transdisciplinary, youth-centred and intergenerational research, which is a bit of a mouthful, even if you are not from Northern Ireland, which I am. So hopefully you've caught all of that. And her purpose is to catalyse research that contributes meaningfully to positive social change and planetary justice. So I'll just pass over to Pip. Pip, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dean, and thanks a lot to AYAC for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today. I never thought when I was a kid growing up on Ngunnawal country in Canberra that I would ever be approached as someone with expertise in anything, but I have always been someone who is really concerned about social justice, and from a very opinionated young person, I then actually started my career in the youth sector working at reachout.com. So I know how much expertise is going to be in this Zoom, and I'm especially looking forward to hearing the discussion in the breakout rooms. And I'm really, really happy to be here. Youth sector workers are, I think, some of the most fabulous and important people in our communities. So but I am going to be sharing with you some of the research and I guess perspectives that I have developed over the last really 10 to 15 years about how we understand youth civic and political participation. And of course, it doesn't start at the ballot box. It certainly doesn't end at the ballot box. But I think this quote, when we can't vote, action is all we have, really is a quote from one of the School Strike for Climate leaders, and it really encapsulates, I think, kind of the essence that we all really need to think about, which is that young people are uniquely disadvantaged in our society, whether they're under the age of 18 and can't vote, or whether they're over the age of 18 and experience structural disadvantage by virtue of age, let alone some of those other intersecting factors. So there's a lot that we can learn from what young people are doing and the way in which they think about politics and civic engagement. And there's a lot more that we can do as both researchers and as practitioners. So the other thing I want to say is, of course, if I can get my thing started, is that youth, the way that we think about youth and civic political participation now is predominantly a Western construct, but of course, children and young people have been part of communities fighting for country, at least since, in our context in Australia, colonisation. And I just want to acknowledge for my part that I'm on Barramadigal lands, where I have a great amount of privilege and benefits to research and work, and that I'm acknowledge that children and young people throughout history, but also particularly in our context and right now, are leading what I think are some of the most interesting and important forms of civic and political participation, and provide a lot of space for us to learn and to work towards a more inclusive and just democracy, which I am quite invested in. So, as Dean said, a couple of months ago, ACARA, the Australian Curriculum and Research Association, released the most recent civic and citizenship test results from Australian students. And this is the table that really set off a big, flurry of concern and consternation in timing-wise, right before an election. Of course, it's sort of been amplified. And the concern here really is that students are not demonstrating through tests in schools that they have high levels of civic and citizenship knowledge. But of course, what I think they've overlooked is that as a part of the same test, students are asked about their attitudes towards the kinds of activities or actions in society that contribute to a strong democracy and a good and equitable community. And what we see here is very different, that students from Year 6 and students from Year 10 really do think that it's very important for us to continue to learn and deepen our understanding of history, that activities that benefit the local community are very or quite important, and that, even really specific things like taking action to protect the environment actually matters for democracy. So I think what we've got is a kind of a debate that is really continuing to reproduce, I guess, kind of deficit accounts of children and young people, even as they're uniquely disadvantaged within the system, both the democratic system and broader social systems, and even when they are telling us already about the things that are important to them and the ways in which they want to take action. It has kind of sparked some interesting discussion about what is a very real problem, which is we only test children and young people on these issues. We don't actually really test other parts of the community. For my part, I actually don't think we should be doing more testing. What we should be doing is doing more listening and then more collaboration with children and young people to understand what it is that matters to them and how they want to make a difference. And of course, over the last really 15 to 20 years, we've seen young people in particular taking the lead around a whole range of social issues. The most, predominant version of this was during the school strikes for climate. And this has been building over a long time and is certainly uneven across the community. But I think these student-led, youth-led organisations and social movements really tell us something important, which is not going to be news to all of you, but that whether or not young people are living the consequences of some of the major issues and challenges that we're facing in society, or whether they're seeking to take action, they do have views and ideas and want to play a role. The problem is that they consistently hear things like this statement, which, the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison and many other politicians echoed, which was they actually don't see schools being spaces for learning about politics, let alone activism. And what we know, due to, I guess, the ongoing criminalisation of protest and other legislative either barriers that are being put up or the ways in which politicians are responding more broadly to the concerns and needs of young people, is that they'd really still think of young people as second-class citizens. So I guess from my point of view, there's really no doubt that this is, we cannot celebrate the fact that young people are becoming a new political force by virtue of making up more of the electorate if we're not actually taking seriously their civic and political rights right before they can vote, and certainly beyond elections. So, but I guess the good news from my point of view is that a lot of the critique and ongoing either celebratory kind of discourse around young people as leaders and change makers, which arguably puts, yes, we should be celebrating those young people who are actively and publicly and visibly doing work to address many of the issues that we're facing. But actually, for most young people, taking part in civic and political life is much more everyday. It's much more connected to their local communities and the individual ways in which they are experiencing everyday life. We know that from the research that even in the most, I guess, kind of predictable ways of thinking about some of these activities, such as volunteering, young people are still actually volunteering at the same or higher rates than the general population. So about 40% of young people say that they undertake volunteer work on a regular basis. But a lot of that volunteer work is informal, it's ad hoc, and it doesn't really fit the same criteria that, for instance, the ABS and other surveys require. We've also done longitudinal research on what young people think matters in the community, and I think I saw Michael Hardup join this Zoom, so I really want to acknowledge that Michael and I have worked on this research together, and this comes from the analysis of 50,000 pieces of writing as a part of the What Matters competition that the Whitlam Institute runs for school students. And what that analysis has shown us is that young people do have a real sense of what matters in their lives. They're more often than not writing about family and community and the ways in the quality of life for their families and their communities. But they're also writing about contemporary events. They're connecting with debates and social issues. We see over time more young people writing about big picture issues around the environment, climate change, social justice, and human and women's rights, along with mental health, social media, and also Australia's role in the world. So I think we know that young people, wherever they live, have an idea about the kinds of experiences they have in their own lives and how these connect to wider issues across the community, even if they have very different ways of being able to express them. And many of you will be familiar with the Mission in Australia research. What I think is really important about the surveys that they've undertaken and what we see in our own research is young people either live at the intersections of these issues, and many of them understand the ways in which these issues connect with and relate to one another. So in much of the research we've been doing, we can see the ways in which young people talk about challenges and problems with the economy and economic equality and its relationship to climate change and care for the environment. Similarly, there is a lot of evidence around young people's awareness that their concerns about the environment, their experiences of equity and discrimination or economic hardship impact on their mental health. So we know what the causes of the causes are, and we know the ways in which they intersect. And why I think this matters in terms of civic and political participation is that this also tells us a lot about the ways in which people's approach to politics and the way that they think about who they are as a person in society, a political actor, and also how they frame what matters to them and how they take action, is now much less to do with becoming a kind of a traditional citizen who develops knowledge through school or in the family or in the community, and then prescribes to or ascribes to a particular political ideology, joins particular organizations and votes for political parties. We know that actually not just young people, but across the population, we're seeing a shift away from those traditional loyalties towards more of a politics of choice, and choice not in the sense that everyone has infinite choice, but more that people are thinking about what are the causes, what are the issues, what are the values that matter to them, and then making decisions about what they do, who they engage with, and who they think can make a difference based on that. And this is contributing to what Professor Pippa Norris at the Harvard School of Government has called the democratic deficit. Now, we often hear about a crisis of democracy, and that's usually leveled at, young people in particular, but other members of the public not being concerned or committed to or knowledgeable about democracy. But what she's actually talking about, and what we have a lot of evidence for, is that the democratic deficit is the difference between the expectations of a public, including a public that's not allowed to vote. So when I'm talking about this, I'm always talking about young people under the age of 18, because they have just as much of a right and just as much of a stake in our democracy as anybody else, more so potentially because of the way in which they're disenfranchised at the moment. But it's about their expectations and the extent to which they're being met by political leaders or those in positions of power. And this is precisely why I think we need to, and why I'm really excited about this conversation and thinking about the broader role of the youth sector, because I don't think, even though I think civics education in schools is certainly part of the solution. I would love to see more of it. I'd like to see it done differently, and I'd like to see it include more content about politics, because that's what students say they want more of. But I don't think that that is where we're going to see any change, partly because we know that older people would also benefit from this kind of knowledge, and actually intergenerational learning would probably be much more valuable than just focusing on students in classrooms. But also because I think we have a lot to do around changing up actually our decision-making structures in lots of different community and institutional contexts. I don't think that SRCs that look like this, which have the teachers at the top of the hierarchy, and we all know that teachers generally do make decisions about the parameters of what students can and can't sort of have a say on in school, and then a very select group of students who are all probably great and have, a lot of, should be a part of an SRC, but my view is that actually until we change the way that we think about who should be allowed to or should be encouraged to see themselves as legitimate participants, someone with valued perspectives and experiences and leadership qualities or capabilities, will continue to be developing 90% of our students to come out of primary school thinking that they're not leadership material, that they don't have much of a say, that no one really cares what they think. And then you all know what that looks like once they get into high school and then beyond. So this is a challenge for us. I think there are lots of ways we can change this up, and many of you are probably doing it. But ultimately, I think the thing we have to tackle is precisely what children themselves, young people under the age of 18, can articulate for themselves, which is that they don't feel like they have any political voice. So what can we do about that? I just want to tackle two kind of key things, and then which hopefully will support the conversation in the breakout rooms. The first is, I think one of the keys is to really move away from teaching and communicating to young people, and instead focusing on communication with and by young people, both on and offline. One of the reasons why, this is probably one of the, I think, the most powerful examples of how this can work and why listening to and helping to share the stories that young people themselves have about what happens in their, local experience, their community, and, are able to kind of connect that to broader structural problems or injustices is this film, In My Blood It Runs, which if you haven't watched it, I really encourage you to have a look. It is a really remarkable story, narrated very much by this young Ariete boy Duan, and it's really about what he experiences as he's growing up in Alice Springs. And to cut a long story short, and without providing any spoilers, Duan has, through this process and through a process of collaboration with his community and filmmakers, also then gone on to do a lot of advocacy around Indigenous education, Indigenous rights, and to take that all the way to the UN. And I'm not suggesting for a second that every young person should be able to, or should be the center of a film. It's really a point around storytelling and creating spaces to hear young people's stories, to listen and to understand and amplify what it is that they experience and what they want to see happen, and to look for opportunities to collaborate in that process. The other thing that I think is really interesting at the moment is we're seeing a complete shift in the social media and the media landscape more broadly, in terms of young people both creating content that helps to support and inform the broader public, but especially a younger audience, around how democracy works, what kinds of issues, people face, how they relate to one another and can play out. And this is both in the kind of, I guess, content creator or independent media space, as well as in some of our, legacy media spaces. And indeed, like even, or, some political parties like the Australian Greens are starting to kind of think about, how to create content that is informative, that speaks with people, that creates platforms for younger publics to have a say. And so, it's just one of the ways in which I think we can also kind of think about how we produce content with and for and by a younger audience that engages with the politics of the day. I love the work that the Australian Youth Climate Coalition has been doing over many, many years in this regard. In lots of ways, I think they and plenty of other organisations were really ahead of the curve in terms of looking for ways to, I guess, really create a very strong bottom-up platform for peer education, both on and offline. And, this year, well, not for the first time, but over the last couple of elections, we've seen them do things like have community forums, online forums, produce scorecards to help young people in particular, but actually they're really helpful. I send them to everybody in my family, including my parents, to kind of prompt their thinking around, how do you use your vote, or what will you do after the election if these are issues that you really care about. And the important thing as well on that I wanted to flag is that the research also shows that while online social media in particular is, a core source of information for young people outside of school, the number one source of information that teenagers say is where they get their political information, their information about community issues from. It's actually in the home. So parents, carers, older siblings, and I would say like youth sector workers, you're not in young people's homes, but many of you are connecting with them in really meaningful and important ways. And so I don't think we can underestimate the role that we as supportive adults in young people's lives play in terms of sharing and connecting them to information about civic and political issues. So where does this leave us in terms of learning for social change? And I put democracy in there in brackets because I am still really committed to democracy, but I think we need a much more robust and participatory form of democracy in order to meet the expectations and needs of young people and to address some of the very significant intergenerational issues that are, if you like, the causes of the issues that we're trying to tackle, whether that's climate change or mental health or economic inequality and so forth. At the risk of leaving out lots and lots and lots of really excellent initiatives that are underway at the moment, and I know there are quite a few of you online who are leading work in this space, I just wanted to flag a couple of things that I think, are really amazing approaches or, programs and resources to the sector in this space. As a way of, like really activating on the ground, both a form of collaboration that lifts up young people as civic and political actors, helps to provide mechanisms for them to tell their stories about what matters to them in their community, what they want done about it, and also provides platforms for shaping the community and institutional forms of decision making around those issues. So, I mean, I think the Blacktown Youth Services, currently has youth-led projects, much like many of the services around the country and lots of other programs and organisations. But I think these youth-led projects are, for me, like an amazing way to not just provide resources and support the issues that young people and organising and the perspectives that young people want to bring to their local community and beyond. But there are also potentially projects that, for instance, could be connected up with other resources in the community. So I work at a university. I'm really interested in how we democratise the resources of the university. I partner with a visual communications professional studio called the Borough at Western. And we've been working with them to work with students to produce really fantastic visual communications from our research. And that's the sort of thing that could potentially be directed to support young people who are leading their own projects in local communities, for example. The second example is the Haywire program. No doubt many of you are really aware of this. The reason I was wanting to flag it today is, one, not just because it again provides a mechanism for young people to tell their stories, but also because they provide grants and other programs that, particularly with a regional and rural focus, and then also use those or support those programs and grants to enable young people to share those stories with a much broader Australian audience. The two other organisations which I think are doing really important work and again provide resources, materials and inspiration, I think, to all of us is Run for It, the organisation which is, has incredible resources and programs that can be provided to young people in the settings where they live and learn, to think about, what does it mean to be a representative to government, whether that's at the local or other levels, and what kinds of capabilities or capacities are necessary, and how do you work towards that or support others in that goal. And then, the Young Mayors program by the Foundation for Young Australians. Again, these are just like actually really groundbreaking initiatives, which I believe respond really well to those needs that I see coming through the research, which are about, yes, we need to support young people with knowledge and skills and capacities and supportive connections. But also we need to turn the lens around in collaboration with young people to ask, how can our communities and institutions change so that they better understand, respect and serve young people? And I think that's really the point that I wanted to end on is, yeah, the way that I see it, at least in my work and in my collaborations with organisations doing the work on the ground, is what are the strategies and supports, and in my case, the research that I can do to support young people in responding to articulating and responding to the things that they see in the community that they either want to address or amplify. And then as a part of that, how do we reshape the way that we understand what civic and political participation is, as well as those discourses of who young people are, and what role they play in society? So with that, I might throw back to you, Dean and Nellie, and thank you for giving me the mic.
Oh, thanks very much, Pip. That was great. And I'm sure that will give people plenty of food for thought when we move out into the breakout rooms. So I suppose, oh, Samantha, would you like to ask a question there? Because we've got a wee Q&A session at the end if you can hold off. I think Samantha's going to hold off. That's good. So basically, guys, what we're going to do now is, oh, it was a clap and it wasn't a hand raise. There we go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into the breakout rooms. And the reason why we wanted to move into the breakout rooms today is, so I come from a research background. I did my PhD in youth political engagement at the University of Liverpool in the UK. But I also come from a practitioner's background. So I've been working with young people over the last 8 years. And coming from that practitioner's background, I know the power of the work that gets done by the youth sector in terms of connecting young people to forms of civic engagement, but also to those more formal processes of political participation. So for a little bit of context, before I came out here, I was working on a few different projects. Some of those were doing grassroots civic initiatives. So we had young people collecting money for food banks, giving back to the local community in a whole host of different ways, taking leaderships through different councils, all the rest within the local community. We also had it where a whole big group of young people from across the island of Ireland took part in a shared island youth forum where they created different visioning documents for the government to take forward what they actually wanted to see in terms of policy changes at that national level, but also across the island in both jurisdictions. So I think that within the youth sector, we have that tremendous ability to do that type of work with young people, to walk alongside them, to meet them where they are at, and develop those sort of more informal relationships that really make that work good. So what I wanted to do in terms of focusing in on our first breakout room discussion was give us that chance as practitioners within the youth sector to have that discussion around how do we best support young people claim their rights and engage in civic and political life. And I really wanted to get that to the core of, what things are we doing right in the sector? What sort of initiatives in our practice would we like to talk about? What works well? Why does it work well? What is it specifically about the work that we do, our values and our approach that leaves us so well placed to do that? Because I know for a fact that one of the areas where I've learned most from has been talking to fellow practitioners. You always learn more when you're sort of listening to what other people have done, what's worked for other people. So I'd like to sort of take that opportunity today as a group and sort of learn from each other. So our first breakout room will be on that question. How can the youth sector best support young people claim their rights and engage in civic and political life? And please do feel free to share some examples from your personal practice. So Nelly, you're going to split everybody else up into breakout rooms, aren't you? Excellent. So you will be allocated to breakout rooms shortly. So hopefully that worked really well. I was just explaining to some of the guys who have the same unfortunate habit that I do of clicking the button too early. The reason why we sort of have set it up to give plenty of room for discussion is because I'm like a bit of a loudmouth myself. So I like meeting people, like hearing what's going on in different organizations, and hopefully learn a few things along the way. So just to kick us back off, I sort of set aside 5 minutes for some people just to feed back, maybe some key points of reflection from the discussion. So would anybody like to raise their hand and just sort of give us a little brief overview or summary of some of the key things that you thought around the question? So how can we best support young people claim their rights and engage in civic and political engagement as a sector. Would anybody else like the feedback there from their group? Yeah, Samantha, go on ahead.
Hey, so whilst we have touched on the question at hand, I think our sort of conversation went in the what challenges that we face when we want young people to have that active participation. And we were just going to bring it back to the main group to sort of open it up if there's any tidbits of advice. The main sort of things that we found were with those under 18s and receiving the consent. So whilst we want to hear from these wonderful young people, whatever their stories are, I know that myself, the challenge is often getting that guardian's permission for a young person to do so. Similarly, there was also the challenges with actually finding the right people. So how do we target or attract or promote, share the message with the young people that will be directly affected, for example?
Yeah, and Samantha, like that last thing that you touched upon in particular really resonates with me. So, for some context, like my research was on non-voters. A lot of my work was with young people who were probably more likely to be disengaged with formal politics. And one of the big things from my research and from my work that I've found out is that those young people, sometimes they lack the sometimes they actively feel excluded and like, that's not for me, I don't care. But sometimes they don't really feel like they have the confidence to say what they think. They think, oh, that's politics. That's not necessarily for me. But when you actually create that little space for them, where you sort of give them that safe space where they can have a voice about whatever it is that matters to them, when you tip the balance of power in their favor, they actually come out and they tell you some of the most interesting things that are going on in the world, because they actually have all of that knowledge built up from just living everyday life, from their families, things that are going on. And one of the things that always sort of struck me is they care about these political issues because they care about social issues that impact upon them and all those people that they care about. And I suppose the question that you're asking there is, how do we make sure that we get those young people who are maybe less likely to come forward, who have really interesting things to say, to link to that? So what I'll do is I'll just open that out to the rest of the panel, and if anybody wants to sort of give a little bit of advice or share a little story about something that they have done that have worked well, that'd be fantastic. Would anybody like to share on that? If not, we can move on.
Dean, while people are thinking, maybe I could just jump in on a point that Samantha made about consent. And I just wondered, Samantha, are you talking about young people giving consent to take part in a process because you have like a duty of care policy or something, or is it consent to participate in a process that's also connected with research?
It's more about sort of that child safeguarding and ensuring that there is a parent or guardian that is aware that these young people will be contributing in whatever forum that might look like. When I was having the discussion in the breakout group, I was sort of more referring to at-risk young people. So ensuring that we're being safe and we're not exposing them to any additional traumas or a whole sleuth of different things. But yeah, the challenge that we've often come across is, yeah, getting that consent, permission, someone's aware of it, that if they are under 18, that someone is aware.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of thoughts maybe for you to consider, and others might have views on this, is I think what really matters in that context is your organization safeguarding processes and the training, especially trauma-informed practice of your own staff. And that from my point of view, that is actually more important than whether or not you get consent from a parent for a young person to take part in a process. In most cases, if they're over the age of 14, even under the NH and MRC guidelines, if depends on what you mean by young person at risk, but if you think that actually the parent may actually be part of the the challenges that they're facing and that they might want to speak to you without their parent knowing, then there's a legitimate reason for them to not actually have to get their parents' consent. So I think it's really worth, not thinking about what your organisation does and having a very rigorous and defendable approach to creating safe environments, and that consent from the young person is the most important thing, and then consent from a parent where possible or advisable is a secondary thing.
Yeah, and Samantha, with regards to consent, like if I'm being honest, we find it reasonably easy with the young people that we have to get consent, and particularly when you're working in community settings, they'll forget their consent forms 4 or 5 times. That's normal. That's fine. Um, one of the challenges that you have, I think, here, where there's more of an online engagement aspect to opportunities, is that there can be that short term trying to turn around consent forms, and that can maybe hinder young people taking up opportunities. But I suppose it's just how you manage that, be proactive about that. But I think the thing that Pip said that was really key is about that element of reflective practice. And there is an article on youth and policy that I'll share later on with the group around how reflective practice in youth work is very, very compatible with trauma-informed principles. So it's about how you show that you are reflecting on your own biases, making sure you're creating that safe environment, but also that you have those safeguarding policies within your own organization. So if there is a concern, that you can pass it up the line, that you can seek support. And we were doing a bit of work in this recently, and there's different sort of helplines within government and stuff where you can ring and say, what do we need for here to be safe, to make sure that it's secure? So in an ideal world, there should always be someone who you can get that advice, that clarification of if you need it. But the key things is, as Pip said, is that reflective practice and working towards those really youth-centered principles of care and consideration. So before we move into the next breakout room, does anybody else have any other reflections or things going off in their head from what they've heard? No, that's cool. That's fine. We'll have a big Q&A with Pip later on. These are just sort of general feedback, reflections. Let's get a sense of what's in the room. So our second breakout room is, and this is the area that I always get teased for because I'm a bit of a nerd, really, about evaluations and about how we communicate what we do, how we make sure that we are really selling the best version of youth work and the youth sector that we can. So the second question is around how do we speak about youth, civic, and political engagement when communicating with stakeholders, policymakers, and funders? So what type of language should we be using? Because sometimes I feel like as in the youth sector, we can be caught in between this sort of gamekeeper by day, poacher by night situation, where in the day when we work with young people, we're like, young people are great, young people change the world, young people have got all these things. But when we're looking for money off policymakers or off funders or whoever it is, we can be like, oh, here's these problems that we have to work with, or here, there's this issue in civics, you need to give us some money so that we can fix that problem for you. Whereas what we really need to do is be consistent across the board, because young people can tell when there's that sort of disingenuous element at play. So how do we really communicate that strengths-based approach to those stakeholders? And what are some of the challenges that we have faced as practitioners? How have we overcome those challenges? So one of the things that's very common within the youth sector is this idea that sort of neoliberal forms of funding and competitive tendering, they get in our way, or there's this focus on, how many numbers we engage and all the rest of it. How do we as a sector come together to say, this is what we do, this is why it's strengths-based, and this is why it's so important that we do it in this way that is really youth-centered and that puts the priority on the young person and really tries to develop their strengths. So how do we avoid that gamekeeper by day, poacher by night situation and be consistent in how we speak about youth political and civic engagement with stakeholders? So Nelly is going to put you out into your breakout rooms. Hopefully that all made sense. So basically, how do we speak to policymakers and make that really convincing strengths-based case for the youth sector? So Nelly will put us in shortly. How are you getting on, Talia?
Yeah, good, thank you.
All good, all
Really
good.
helpful, really useful last discussion, actually, is a question we ask ourselves a lot.
Oh yeah, it's my favorite question. I always get told that I either yap too much about it or like, talk too much about it, but I think it's a good question, man. There's a lot that we can do.
Sorry, Talia, I disappeared mid sentence because I pressed a button.
You're not the only one. It happens all the time.
Well, that's good. So, guys, I'm not going to believe that a group of people in the youth sector haven't got some things to say on this. So, would you like to feedback? I think Talia sort of started feeding back some of the stuff from their discussion. Talia, would you like to feedback some more from your discussion?
Sure. Sorry, I feel like I dominated the last discussion and now I'm going to dominate this discussion, which my team will probably feel is pretty standard behavior for me. So other people jump in, please. But I was just talking about what we've learned over time with the Young Mayors program and how we share the way the program is operating and the way that it works with stakeholders like government, also councils, mayors, CEOs, councillors, and how you have to sort of shift your communication based on your audience and who you're talking to because it's got to resonate with them. But how do you do that in a way that is always aligning with your own values and setting boundaries around, what you will and won't what threads you will and won't pick up from their own priorities. So the example that I used is that in Queensland, which Jenna knows very well, there's a big narrative around youth crime, and we just want to stay right away from that. But when that's the dominant narrative, how do you talk about if that's the frame that adults are bringing into the conversation, how do you make them listen to what you want to say, which is a completely different thing? So yeah, it's not something I have an answer to. It's just a question that we're always asking ourselves and a challenge that we've always got.
If you get the answer, let me know, because it's that thing, isn't it, as well? Like within the youth sector, particularly within youth work and social work and all these different sort of people that we have in the call today, a lot of what we do is very values and process driven. And you always have to sort of have that reflection within yourself of how much do I give up for strategic to get a little bit further along with this to advance the work, and then when does it become too much? And I think that's not really a question that anyone has the answer to, but hopefully if I sort of having that conversation or spaces where we can have that conversation as practitioners, we can maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with where we are. And just before I pass over to the Q&A, would anybody else like to make a little point of reflection on some of the discussions that they were having in their group? We can use the language of government speak and call it knowledge diffusion if you like. Would anybody like to diffuse their knowledge before we go to Q&A? Perfectly fine if nobody's willing to diffuse knowledge. Yes, go on ahead, Sad.
Yeah, thank you. So I was in a room with, sorry, I think you turned the camera off, but I was in a room somewhere. But essentially, we were talking about creating spaces for young people to meet, to congregate, recognizing the diversity, the intersectionality that they bring, and what large group settings are, and the vulnerabilities within that. But I think we really bonded over the fact that, like, creating supportive structures, like a youth advisory group, looking at who you can bring and the connect that you can have with different policymakers. One of the members of the breakout session, like you mentioned, like looking at how policymakers and like the older generation, when they go into a room full of young people, how they're changing up their language, changing the tone, and even some of the words that they're using. So just being able to create those opportunities, being able to create those moments, and just bridging that divide, and just showing that policymaking advocacy is a space for everyone, and everyone can have a say. That's really what we got to.
Yeah, that's something that I've encountered quite a bit since I've come over here, which is that a lot of these processes that are supposed to incorporate young people and are supposed to be changing to incorporate young people into them through the different government structures of government or tiers of government, it's actually working the other way around, where young people are the ones who are having to change themselves to fit those structures. So they're having to turn up, dress a particular way, speak a particular way. And then you kind of almost want to get that authenticity back into it to give them that true ability to speak to their issues in the way that they're most comfortable with. So I think that is definitely a conversation that we do need to have with policymakers and funders and saying, we really need to create those spaces where young people can be themselves. because I think many people on this call have probably observed situations where that maybe hasn't been the case. And I suppose as well, if we take that out a little bit further, if young people don't feel like they can be themselves or say what they think, how representative is the emerging policy of young people's perspectives? So I think that's definitely a really, really good point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Pip back onto the call to field questions about all the things we discussed, everything and anything under the sun. Pip will be our font of wisdom. Not to put any pressure on you, Pip. So does anybody have a question for Pip?
Hi, Ria speaking. Can you hear me? Awesome.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from Pip about the organization that you worked with to translate some of your academic research into something that was a bit more like student friendly or young person friendly, because I think that's definitely something we could use over at BKSRC to translate our research and make it more engaging. So if you could tell me a bit about that, that'd be awesome. Oh, your mic's off, Pip.
Sorry. Thanks a lot for the question. This is like one of the things that I'm still working on, to be honest. Like, I don't think I've got like the silver bullet or anything, but I guess in our work, one of the things we've been incredibly concerned about is that we produce research that young people can take up and use in their own advocacy and activism. And like the best way to do that is actually to create those outputs, those forms of communication with young people, better still have them actually create that. But that can be like a lot to ask in some cases, to go from like an academic journal, or a big report down to like a 2-page infographic and whatever. But I think there are two things that we've been doing. One is, so the organization I mentioned is called The Burrow. It's at Western Sydney University. And it's the 4th year professional studio for students studying visual communications. And yeah, they have clients and they have to respond to their clients. And this year we've worked with them in one of our projects. And yeah, maybe Dean, you can help me share with the network when we're ready to distribute those pieces. It's all around student climate advocacy and activism. And the impact that it has on democracy. But we'd love to share those with you. But certainly if you have a piece of research that you'd like to communicate better or differently and have those communications created by students, that's one mechanism. The other is I just shamelessly put in the chat that we've just launched a podcast called The Silent Majority, where the silent is like crossed out. And yeah, like I think one of the things we're trying to sort of play around with is just making the stakes really low for young people who want to have a say on particular things, and then package those up in conversation with, researchers, people who work in the sector, people who are, leading social enterprises or other initiatives, and trying to create more of an intergenerational conversation around some of these issues, where people can bring their own expertise, whatever that looks like, whether that's from lived experience or learning or, professional practice or research, to the discussion. So I think the only other thing that I would say that we've found work tends to be very helpful is co-authoring publications. And again, that takes time for people to learn how to do that well. It's hard to write with other people regardless of where you're coming from, but yeah, that's really worthwhile. And I can also just pop up into the chat. So Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney University, we've put together a lot of tools and resources in partnership with a lot of our partners and the young people who we collaborate with, to support intergenerational collaboration using youth-centered methods. And yeah, they're available, and a lot of them are focused on research, but I think can be really well adapted to other settings. So I'll pop that in the chat, and yeah, I'd love to know if you check them out and find them helpful.
No, thank you so much. I'm sure it'll all be super helpful. And I love to hear a co-research shout out. It's something that we got to do for the first time last year, and it was such a great experience, and for us and for the young person as well. And yeah, looking forward to seeing your resources when they come out. With the podcast, is that something that young people come on to speak with academics on? Is that, did I get the idea right?
Yeah, so at the moment, that podcast is hosted by Varsha Yajman, who is a older young person, but was one of the school strike leaders in New South Wales back in the day. And so, yeah, so we use a couple of different mechanisms. So there's like Vox Pops and then invited guests. We've literally only released one episode, so it's rough as guts, and we would really love people's feedback. And iterating the format and so on. But really, it's about saying, how do we have different kinds of conversations about the big issues that young people are facing, center their voices and bring them into dialogue with artists, researchers, policymakers, scientists, whoever else, in order to think about, well, how could we do things differently to create change? That sounds very aspirational, and maybe a bit arrogant, but like it is literally, we're just putting our efforts into trying to kind of create those kinds of resources, because young people are telling us they want to learn more about research, they want to utilize research, they want to talk with others about it, they want to share their lived experience and their own expertise based on what they've done in their lives. And they're sick of just talking. Well, some people are sick of just talking with one another about it, and we're hoping that this format also maybe looks attractive to people who maybe don't feel, I can't remember, maybe Dean, you said that a lot of young people feel like they don't know enough to have a say, and so putting yourself out there is really can be challenging, whereas at least on a podcast, you can say, yeah, this is what I think, I don't know if it's right, and it can still be part of the conversation. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I'd love to know what you think.
Guys,
Thanks so much.
just to let you know, so we also launched a sort of sector blog, and we're really interested just to get perspectives from anybody who's doing a little bit of research around youth issues, who's in the sector. And we're very sort of flexible in terms of submission guidelines. We just want to give people who are writing or conducting that research as much scope as possible to just sort of say it as they want it to be, in as plain a language as possible. So if you have little bits of research or stuff that you're working with and you would like it to get better known, we can put it up there. We can also, things that we've done in the past is we've got young people to write perspectives on different reports, different things, and put it into their own language. And then we put that up. And we also so we have a network of over 2,000 young people who are associated with us. And we put those sort of findings out to the young people through Brains Trust newsletters. We have 4,000 followers across different social media platforms. So use the youth organisations, use the peak bodies, use the people who are working with young people face to face. The other thing that I would say to that, and I understand it's not my Q&A, is one of the things that we did very well in the last place that I worked is that we developed youth work resources, youth engagement resources based off of research. So put it into those interactive, informal methodologies to bring that research to life, so it's not just something that you're reading. It's something that you can do after doing, maybe a little game or something that's more interactive. So think about things like that, like get creative with it. And if you have any ideas and you would like someone to help you disseminate that, like get in touch with us. We'll help you as best we can, you know. So have we got any more questions? I might do that really bad youth worker thing where I catch someone's eye and just ask them if they've got a question. I'll just pick somewhat random. I'll do it. I'm sorry. If I do it to young people, I have to do it to everybody. Let me see. Sasha, have you got a question?
I don't know.
You don't? Oh, you're doing me dirty here.
Dean, maybe can I yeah, I really appreciate that there's a lot been going on in this, and it's kind of getting to the end of the day as well. So I'll try not to take the lack of questions personally. But if I could just maybe pick up on something else that I think I've heard a lot about today, and that's around, how do we support this storytelling by and about young people, and I'm using storytelling kind of broadly there in terms of sort of like a lot of forms of communication. And I think one of the things that I've struggled with for a long time, and I heard a bit in the discussion, is that we it's very hard for us to get ourselves out of the bind of talking about youth leaders or the youth problem or youth at risk or vulnerable young people, and for lots of reasons, but then also because it's challenging without moving to those two poles to be able to state the case for why it's really important to hear from, create space for, collaborate with, recognize the rights of, and achieve better justice for young people. But one of the things that I think can help is where we maybe try and think about and work with young people to identify what are the really interesting stories where we're working, where young people are identifying, perhaps collaborating with others, or where something they've said or done has led to change, even if it's low level change, even if it's incremental change, even if it's about a change in perspective. So, getting that one counsellor to say, what I heard from the youth council really changed my mind about this problem, or, through to sort of much more significant stories. Because I think in a way, the challenge for us all is to kind of be able to articulate in a strengths-based way what is at stake, right? But then also be able to tell the stories of what the benefits, what good can come, and show how that benefits everyone. And so I'm just sort of saying that because I don't think it's necessarily easy. But in lots of what I heard many of you say in the breakout and also in the main group, I think that there are snippets, there are insights and stories from your practice that can tell the stories of the interesting and ordinary, in inverted commas, or everyday young people that highlight what's possible if we do this differently. And for my part anyway, like one of the things that I'm trying to do more of now is to just catch those stories and share them, not in a TikTok sense necessarily, but with that in mind, it doesn't have to be like a massive project, it doesn't have to be a full-on evaluation, it doesn't have to be a full report, or like a major news story. It can just be more populating more and more and more, with ideally by young people themselves, what things they're doing, what incremental change it's making, what the benefits are to them, to more young people and to the broader community, but without kind of necessarily only relying on those leadership or youth at risk type narratives. So that's just
in some ways that's kind of like making the evaluation process of projects and of youth engagement more organic, isn't it? And finding those different ways to communicate those stories and those narratives that young people tell through that work.
Yeah.
And extending the picture really so that those things are captured. Because so often they're pushed to the side because, as you said, there's that focus on youth leadership or how many numbers you engaged or what was it, and actually just focusing on those stories and sitting with them, because when we reflect on them, we can see that they are a social good in and of themselves for what they do for young people, but also for how they can bring communities together. I mentioned before about that little collection for the food bank. There was a bit of problems in the town before that between the young men and older people in the town, where the young men were seen as being antisocial, and they were seen as not really contributing or were seen very negatively. And then they carried out that food bank, went about with their little flyers. They ended up with, I think it was 4 trolleys loads of food that they got. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that older people in the community came and spoke to the young men, developed a relationship with them, and there was that sense of understanding. Whereas that's quite a minor thing, but in terms of that community at that time, it was more important. So I think even those smaller things as well as those bigger things, I completely agree. And I think that's quite a nice note to end on. So hopefully, guys, you haven't found my chaotic facilitation style too much to handle, and you'll all come back for the next one whenever we do it. And just as like Pip was saying before with their podcast, this is very experimental to us. This is our first youth sector discussion. And as I said before, like I'm a big mouth, so I like talking. I like finding out about what's going on with other people, learning what's going on in their practice, hearing about different things. So hopefully that was good for you guys and you enjoyed it and you got something out of it, as well as hearing that really a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what we're saying, it's backed up by the evidence that people like Pip are conducting at Western Sydney University. So before I go, I'd just like to direct you guys to that blog that I spoke about before. It's called NYPN Briefing. If you have any ideas for it, please get in touch. Also, if you're members of ours, we'll be recirculating a membership survey in the next couple of days. So it'll be good for you to fill it out and get back to us if you are. And our next sort of event for the NYPN will be a roundtable. And we really want to make sure that what we do here is relevant to the sector. It's relevant for what people are working on. So if you just want to drop either myself an email or the info account at AYAC an email if you have any suggestions for what you would like the roundtable to address and things like that there. But otherwise, guys, you are all free to go. And hopefully Sasha will forgive me for putting her on the spot. And I will be welcome back with Sasha at DCFD at some point. Thanks very much. So thank you very much, guys. And thanks very much to Pip Collins. That was really fantastic facilitation. I learned some stuff as well. So hopefully it was all good for you. And we will see you on the next one. All the best.